Welcome to the Mobile Weekly webinar. Today's topic, we're going to create an application that integrates with Salesforce SOAP service. What you see on my screen here is your Salesforce interface. We're going to do a simple app that just provides accounts and contacts. So I have access to the SOAP API from my Salesforce account. The first thing we need to do is we're going to go ahead and create our project on RhoHub. We'll call this the Salesforce. I'll just call it a simple Salesforce mobile app. So it says our project was created, and once these have finished, we can then go ahead and check out the RhoSync project and the Rhodes project. So we'll do a git clone, and also copy this URL as well. So now we've cloned our two projects. We're going to start with the back end and start with getting our data from Salesforce. So we'll go to our RhoSync project here. And we'll generate our two sources. We want an account source and a contact source to match our two models. So we're going to have a problem though, because we're using the SOAP adapter, which generates objects based on the name of the SOAP calls, and it has one named account and it has one named contact already. So we need to give them something a little bit more than that to make sure we don't have any class conflicts. So we're going to say RhoSync source, and we'll call this S account instead of just account. And then we're also going to generate our source for contact, and we'll call it S contact. The next thing we need to do is go get our WSDL file. Because it's a SOAP service, the WSDL is what defines the methods that we can call. So if we go to Setup here on Salesforce, we can go to Develop, and finally API. And it gives us the list of WSDLs that we can do. So we're going to save the enterprise WSDL from Salesforce, which I already have, so I'm going to go ahead and copy that here. And what we do with the WSDL file is there's WSDL to Ruby, and this gives you the options of how to generate the client side. So I'm actually just going to copy some files I generated already. And if we take a look, there was 3 files copied here called default RB, default mapping registry, default driver.rb. These 3 files is what provides us with our interface to the SOAP API. So now that we have that, we'll actually start working on our webinar, or on our source adapters. So we'll open this up with our text editor. And the first thing we need to do is define our authentication. So we'll go to our application RB. Because we're using SOAP, we need to include the SOAP gem. So we say require Ruby gems, and then gem SOAP for R. We also need to require our generated code. So we're going to say require sources / default driver. So now we need to do some authentication and save the possible results. So we'll have our success equals false. We'll have our login endpoint for the Salesforce web service, which is just say endpoint URL, and this is defined in Salesforce's documentation of where the login endpoint is. We're going to create our login object, which is what we pass into the login function. And finally, we're going to have our actual login code. So our login code here is an exception handling block, and so we're going to call the login method on the SOAP service with the username and password that was provided. If this fails, it returns an exception and you get login error, and success remains false, so you get an error message on your client. If this succeeds, then we save the server URL, and actually we don't need to change it at this point, so we can just remove that line. Some extra code I had in there. But we're going to save the server URL and our session into our Redis data store by using store.putValue. So we got an endpoint URL, which is the endpoint for your organization. It's stored with the username, and you get a session that is stored with your username and your session as well. And finally, we set success equals to true. So what this does is the client logs in, the username and password gets sent to the Salesforce SOAP API, which will then return us the new endpoint to use for all of our future calls and the session ID to use for the session. So now that that is all done and working, we'll move on to doing our sources. So we'll start with our account source. We're going to have to require our default driver here as well. And in login, we'll set up our actual SOAP connection, because login is called before any of the other query and the sync methods. So we need to log into the backend data service. So the way that the authentication works with the SOAP API for Salesforce, you have to set the header with your session ID. So client auth header is something we actually added to our default.rb after we had generated it. It's this section here. And so there's the header, which is the queue name here, Salesforce session header. We have one class variable here, one instance variable. And then we define on outbound, it sets the session ID, and on inbound, it grabs the session ID. So it just manages the session ID header that's required by the Salesforce API. And if we take a look here, all we're doing is we're getting our auth object, setting the session ID to the stored value we had stored earlier using current user.login. Our endpoint URL, we're getting the same. And so then we create our new SOAP object with that endpoint URL. And then to the header handlers, we add our auth header handler. So now we have an object that connects to our SOAP backend and it will pass in the variables that we need to do further queries. So the next step, we're going to do our query object. And in this example, we're only going to implement query. So in our query object, we're going to simply get the results and put them into our hash. So our Force API here, a Salesforce API, says we can do a query with a string. So our query is going to be, we're getting accounts, so we want to get the ID, name, phone, and website. And so this is going to match what we generate with our Rhodes application. And when we have all those records here, now we just iterate through all of the records and we set the ID, name, phone, and website. So that's how we pull the data out of the SOAP service here. The next step we're going to do is implement the similar API in our contact. So we'll go back to our contact here. We're going to implement the same require statements. Our login method is going to be the same. We simply set up our backend and set up our SOAP handler. And our query is going to look very similar as well. We'll put this in here. And so the query we're doing in our contact is essentially the same, except we're just saying select the ID, account ID, name, phone, and email from our contacts. And then we're storing those values in these fields as well. So the next thing we need to do is test that our functions are actually working. So we're going to go to our spec tests here and implement a couple of tests here. So the first thing is before each, it's going to do the setup test for it. So I'm actually going to just put in my login here. And in query, all we're going to do is authenticate and then run test query.inspect. And so when we run the test, we'll be able to see whether or not we have records. And the final thing is, so we should have test query dot. Let's see, we'll make this a little bit of a smarter test. We'll say result equals test query dot inspect. And then we'll say put s test query inspect so we can see the result. And we'll also say test query dot length should be greater than 0. So now that we've done that, we can go to our RhoSync app here, and we'll say rake RhoSync spec. So I have some issues here. Cannot find mapped class user. So I believe this has to do with our definitions here. Actually, that needs to be user, so let's try that again. So our S account is running. We can see that it dumped out a whole bunch of information and our test passed. So now we're going to implement the same for our contacts. We'll say test query dot length should be greater than 0. So we'll save that and we'll run our test again. So query ran. It was successful. Contacts ran and gave us our large list of contacts. So this means is that our source adapters are working. All we need to do now is start our RhoSync server. So what we're seeing here is superclass mismatch for class user. So the problem here is that our generated default has this user class, and we need to, we're having a class conflict here. So I renamed it to suser, and we get rid of that contact. So probably a better way to implement this is to actually namespace this whole driver, and that would get rid of your class conflicts. However, at this point we can just change the name of this class since we aren't actually using this class when it is being run. So now that we have our RhoSync server running, we need to get our IP address, which I have here, because we'll need to point our Rhodes application to that IP address as well. So we'll go now to our Rhodes application. And we're now going to generate our default, we're going to generate our models in our Rhodes application. And we're going to match those models and those fields that we defined in our source adapter. So we'll say Rhoden model as account. It's going to have name, phone, website. And we'll say Rogen model as contact. And our contact is going to have name, phone, email, account, ID. We're also going to run set Rhodes SDK to make sure it's using our local Rhodes, and finally open this in our text editor as well. So the first couple of things we want to do, we're going to change our sync server to point to the local machine instead of the RhoSync sync server. So when we build this, it'll just run against my local machine. We need to enable sync for the models that we've created. So we go simple to our model and just say enable sync. And we're going to add a little bit of logic to make this look a little bit nicer and have a little bit more functionality to it than simply just displaying the listing. So we're going to go to our index page first, and we're going to create our two links here. Save me some typing time. I'm going to go ahead and paste it. So we have a link to our accounts, and we're going to have a link to our contacts. We'll go to our account controller, and when it shows an account here, we're going to go to our show method in our account controller. Our show view, rather. And we're going to add an extra button on this that will point to our contacts controller, and it'll give it a list of contacts here. So we'll paste this in. And what you see is we have our controller. It's a link here points to the contact URL, the action index, and then we're going to add a query to it, passing in the account as ID. Account.object is the ID, and then it has a link for contacts. Now we're going to go to our contact controller. And now we've defined that our contact controller, we can actually take a parameter called account. So what we're going to do is do a search here. And I'm going to just paste in this code as well. So what this code's doing here is, if we have a parameters account, we're going to do a find with conditions that the account ID matches the params account. So if somebody clicks on that link from viewing the account, it will then go to the index of this controller, but only show the methods for that, or the contacts that belong to that account. And finally, in our show ERB, we need to, in our show model, we're also going to find the account that matches. So if we have a contact, we're going to do a find on this contact, getting the account ID that matches this contact, so we can display the name and the link in our show view. And finally, going to the show view, in the ERB, we're going to add a link, and this link is going to point to the account controller show. The ID is going to be the object here, and the name of the link is going to be the name. So the end goal here is I'm going to have an application that I can select accounts or contacts, and then if I select an account, I can see all the contacts associated with that account. Or if I select a user directly, then I can see the account that that user belongs to. So now that I've made these changes, we're going to go ahead and run it on the iPhone, run it on the simulator, and make sure everything is working okay. So we'll say reg run iPhone. We have now our iPhone simulator up. We'll go to our application, and so far it's looking like we expect. We have no accounts. We have no contacts. So now we're going to log in and enter our Salesforce credentials here. So we'll hit login. So it says wait, so it's doing the login, and if we go to our RhoSync, we can see client login returned to 200, client create, and we can now see the sync happening. And if we go back to our simulator, we can now go ahead and take a look at our accounts. And so if we see all of these accounts listed here, we can go back and look at our Salesforce accounts. And we'll see that the Salesforce accounts here, we'll say view all accounts. So we can see our list of accounts matches what is actually in our Salesforce accounts.